Once again, hello everybody. Welcome to the National Baseball Hall of Fame and Museum in Cooperstown, New York. We are broadcasting from the Hall of Fame. The museum has reopened since the end of June. We're glad that you could join us online today for the latest in our series of virtual programs. We're going to do something a little bit new that I'll explain in a moment. Let me first introduce myself. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Bruce Markison. I work at the Education Department at the Baseball Hall of Fame. My office is actually right next door to the Bud Selig Center, where we are broadcasting this afternoon. So today we debut a different kind of a program. We've done some histories of baseball cards. We've done one of our educational units called Pop Culture through baseball cards. Today, though, something a little bit different. It's called Baseball Card Mysteries. What we're going to do is look at three vintage baseball cards. I call them vintage because they're from the 1970s and 1980s. I think that's probably old enough to be considered a vintage baseball card era. We're going to look at three cards, all of which have mistakes on them. And the mistake is in the photograph of the player. So the player who is listed on the card does not match the photograph for a variety of reasons. The wrong photograph was placed onto each of these cards, and we're going to explore that in some detail today. The first card that we want to take a look at, you can see it on your screen as we ask the eternal question, what happened to the real Dave Collins? Now, for those of you who don't remember Dave Collins, he was an outfielder who played back in the 1970s and 1980s. Switch hitting outfielder, a good line drive hitter, very fast, stole a lot of bases. Played primarily left field, also played center field. Now, let's go back to his 1976 Topps card. And this is actually his first Topps card. And this card is accurate. This is an actual photograph of Dave Collins. So here, the photograph matches the player. And you can see Collins with kind of the elongated mustache, long sideburns, large glasses, which were quite in common back in the mid-1970s. Also wearing the Angels cap and the Angels colors of the day. Collins was a guy who came up in the Angels organization. The Angels thought he would be a really good player, but he kind of struggled. He didn't really hit much higher than about 260, 265. He also, even though he was very fast, his base running techniques were a little bit raw, and he would get caught stealing more than the Angels would have liked. Defensively, he had great speed, but didn't have a particularly strong throwing arm. So that's generally why teams tended to put him in left field. The Angels thought Collins would develop into a 300 hitter, a big-time speedster who was going to steal about 50, 60 bases a year. Didn't quite develop for them as he would later in his career. So the Angels, after the 1976 season, they decided to leave Collins unprotected in the expansion draft. You had two teams coming to the American League in 1977. Seattle Mariners, one of the teams, they selected Collins with the 14th selection of the draft. So Seattle and Toronto, they would take turns picking players from established teams. Collins went with the 14th pick. Now the Mariners would end up making Collins their opening day DH in their inaugural season of 1977. They also used him as a left fielder, but he failed to hit much. He batted only .239. Base stealing was a little bit less than what the Mariners desired. He did steal 25 bases, but he was caught 10 times. Now, later in his career, Collins would develop into a very fine player for the Cincinnati Reds. He had some terrific seasons playing in left field for Cincinnati. And he played so well for the Reds that when he became a free agent, he signed a lucrative deal with the New York Yankees. So that's a little bit of background and history of Dave Collins. Let's go now from the 1976 to the 1977 seasons. So we see Collins, his 1976 Topps card. And then on the very right, we see his 1977 OPC card. OPC was a Canadian company that used to issue baseball cards every year. And what they generally did was they would use the same design that Topps would do. They had permission from Topps to do that. Sometimes the photographs on the front of the card would be identical to the photographs on the back of the card, or actually to the photographs that Topps was using. So sometimes the OPG cards looked pretty much the same, at least on the front, as the Topps cards. The back of the card would be a little bit different. The color of the back of the card, the stock paper or cardboard that was used was a little bit different, and they might have maybe a different font. So the back of the card would vary from Topps, but oftentimes the front of the card would be virtually the same. Now, in this case, the OPG card, the Canadian version of the card, is actually going to be a lot different than what Topps put out in 1977. Now, before we show you that Topps card again, let's establish that OPG has the right photograph of Dave Collins. That is Collins right there. And again, you can see how similar he looks to the photograph that Topps used in 1976. He's got the same style mustache, the glasses. What's been done here is that OPG airbrushed the Mariners colors onto an existing Angels cap and uniform. So the Mariners colors and the logo that you see here, those are airbrushed. So that part of the card has been sort of revised as an update to 1977. But the photograph was taken during the 76 season when Collins was still with the California Angels. And again, it's the right photograph. In both cases here, that is Dave Collins. That is the correct and proper photo. Now we compare the 1977 OPG card to the 1977 Topps card. And here we see, well, a major difference. I remember when I first collected this card. It was back in 1977. Yeah, that's how old I am. I go back that far. Actually, I go back further. But going back then, I kind of looked at this and said, you know, that doesn't really look like Dave Collins. I didn't really think much of it. I didn't put any thought into it until many years later when I decided to do some research into this card and actually wrote about it. I used to write for not a magazine, but a website called the Hardball Times. And I did an article probably about 8 years ago about this card. That's where this whole mystery came out of, or at least my interest in the mystery. So you look at the photograph on the right, compare it to the photograph of the real Dave Collins on the left. You can see these are two different guys. Both have glasses, but one has facial hair, one does not have facial hair. One has like straight brownish or black hair. The other one has kind of blondish hair that's been done into some kind of a perm. Now, the 1977 Topps card, the Mariners cap, that is airbrushed because, again, the photograph was taken in 1976. Typically, that's what Topps has done over the years. That year's card is usually featuring a photograph of the player from the previous season. So the photograph on the right, while it's not Dave Collins, was a California Angels player, and it was taken during that 1976 season. But it's not Collins. It was one of his Angels teammates, and that's what we're going to try to figure out. So the OPG card has the right image. The Topps card has the incorrect image. So clearly, this is not Dave Collins. It must be another player from the Angels who played sometime during that 1976 season. The question is who. We are going to come up with an answer. Although it took me a while to figure this out, and I basically did it with help from lots of other people. So the best way to go about this is to go through every player who played for the Angels in 1976 and kind of use a process of elimination. So over the next few slides, we're going to look at lists of players who played for California in 1976. Now you can see the first player on the list, Andy Etchebarren, and you can see his 1977 Topps card. Andy Etchebarren just passed away last year. Longtime catcher, had some really good years with the Orioles, and then played later with the California Angels. Now, as you can see, Andy Etchebarren, unique-looking guy, looked like no one else. So we know that Andy Etchebarren is not the guy on the 1977 Dave Collins card. We look at the other players on the list. You have Tony Salita, who was a first baseman DH. He was a Samoan, also black, so we know that it's not him. Jerry Remy, white, now the broadcaster for the Red Sox, but no glasses. Jerry Remy didn't wear glasses when he played. So we know that he cannot be the player on the Dave Collins card. Similarly, Dave Chalk, also no glasses, didn't wear them, so we eliminate him from consideration. Then we have first baseman Ron Jackson, black player, so we know it's not him. We then have Rusty Torres, a Latino outfielder. It's not him. We have Bobby Bonds and Tommy Davis, two veteran players, both African-American. We know it's not them. And then we have a catcher, Ed Herman. Ed Herman was a catcher who did not wear glasses, at least not at this particular time in his career. And he also looked a lot different from the player that we see on the Dave Collins card that's in question. So we eliminate all 9 of the names on this initial list, but we've still got a ways to go. Here at the top, we see Bill Melton. You can look at the image of Melton on the right-hand side. Clearly, that does not match to the image on the 1977 Dave Collins card. Melton also did not wear glasses. Then you have infielder Mario Guerrero, Latino. It's not him. We have Dan Briggs, didn't wear glasses. Dave Collins always wore glasses. And the player on the 1977 card, as it turns out, wore glasses pretty much all the time as well. So it's not Dan Briggs. It's not Leroy Stanton. It was black. Joe LaHood, no glasses. Orlando Ramirez, Latino. Mike Easler, who was early in his career, would eventually become a standout with the Pittsburgh Pirates. He was kind of a backup, played part of the season with the Angels. We know it's not him, though, because, again, he's African-American. Then we have Adrian Garrett, white player, but no glasses. And then Mike Miley, no glasses as well. Still got a few more names to work through. Pictured here, we have Carlos Lopez, who, as it turns out, actually joined the Mariners for their 1977 season and was a teammate of Dave Collins for that inaugural Mariners team. But we know it's not Carlos Lopez in the photograph. Lopez, Latino, also does not wear glasses. Orlando Alvarez, also a Latino player. Paul Dade, African-American. Tim Nordbrook, Billy Smith, both white players, but no glasses for either one. Ike Hampton, backup catcher. He happens to be black as well. And then we have Frank Tanana, Nolan Ryan, two of the more well-known pitchers for the Angels that year. Neither of them wore glasses at the time. And then there's another pitcher, Don Kirkwood, a right-hand pitcher. Well, he did not wear glasses either. So it could not be him on this 1977 Topps Dave Collins card. Still a few more names to eliminate. A lot of guys played for the Angels in 1976. We see Dick Drago, the veteran reliever, who was pitching for the Angels around this time. He didn't wear glasses. Another pitcher, Paul Hartzell, didn't wear glasses either. Sid Monge, a pitcher, Latino. And then the other players that you see on the list, Mickey Scott, John Verhoeven, Andy Hassler, Jim Brewer, Mike O'Very, Steve Dunning, Gary Wheelock, all of these players did not wear glasses. So it's not them. Now, having said that, I want you to remember the name Mike O'Very because he is going to come into play a little bit later on. So after we've eliminated all these players, we are left with 4 players who could possibly be the man on the card. So these 4 players are Bruce Bochy, Terry Humphrey, Gary Ross, and an outfielder named Bobby Jones. Bochy was a first baseman outfielder, Humphrey a catcher, Ross a pitcher, Jones an outfielder. All 4 of these guys wore glasses, either all the time or in the case of Bochy, some of the time. Some games, I remember seeing him play, some games he didn't have glasses on, sometimes he did have glasses on. So let's start with Bruce Bochy. So here we see an image of Bochy with the Angels, 1976, and we can compare it to the photograph of the player that mystery player on the 1977 Topps card. And you can see totally different hair, different facial features. Bhakti's chin looks like it's a little bigger, fuller, a little thicker, I think, in the jowls as well. Really, quite clearly, it's not Bruce Bhakti who is in this photograph. Now, some of you may be wondering, you might say, well, wouldn't necessarily have to be a guy who played for the Mariners in 1977. Again, that's not the case, because when these photographs were taken, they were all taken in 1976, and they were all taken when these men were still playing for the California Angels. When these photographs were taken, nobody knew that they were going to become Seattle Mariners in 1977. So the mystery player does not necessarily have to be someone who played for the Mariners with Collins in 1977. That's kind of irrelevant. Again, all the photographs were taken 76 when the players were in California. So let's try the catcher, Terry Humphrey. Well, you can see Humphrey's got big glasses, just like the player on the right, but that's pretty much where the similarity ends. The nose looks different style mustache. Really not a lot of similarities here. I think quite clearly, Terry Humphrey is not the man in the photograph on the baseball card on the right side of your screen. So we eliminate Terry Humphrey. So now we're down to two. Here we have pitcher Gary Ross, who, as I recall, almost always wore glasses when he was on the mound. That's pretty much where the similarity ends here. I mean, he's got a much fuller face, different kind of a chin, certainly different hair, doesn't look anything like the man on the 1977 Topps card. So I think we pretty safely can eliminate Gary Ross. So if we use process of elimination, we're left with Bobby Jones. Now, when I first looked at the card of Bobby Jones on the left, his 1977 Topps card, along with this mystery player on the Dave Collins card, initially I didn't see a lot of resemblance. Player on the right has a permed hairstyle. Player on the left, Bobby Jones, does not. Straight hair, darker hair. They both have glasses. Jones wears sunglasses on the left. The player on the right, wherever that is, wearing glasses without a tint. So at first glance, I didn't see a lot of similarities, but then somebody pointed out to me and said, you know what, look at their chin. There's a lot of similarities in the chin of the two players here. Jones on the left and this mystery man on the right. And you can even use a little bit of imagination and kind of see some similarities in the nose as well, even though they're from different angles. The picture of Jones on the left, we see him straight ahead. The picture on the right, that player, we're seeing a side angle, but there are some similarities, kind of a thin, longer nose. So we do see some things that are in common. We can't totally rule out Bobby Jones. So using this whole process of elimination, we've come down to one player, and at this point, I'm not convinced it's Bobby Jones. Starting to wonder, maybe this is a bat boy or a ball boy. Maybe this is some minor leaguer who didn't even play for the Angels in 1976. Maybe he got called up, didn't appear in a game. Maybe the photograph was taken in September when the rosters expand. Maybe this isn't Bobby Jones either. Maybe we'll never figure out who it's going to be. Well, let's take another look at Bob Jones or Bobby Jones. This is a later card of Bobby Jones. This is 1985. This is 8 years later. Now, the Bobby Jones card on the right, now we have a side angle, which gives it some similarity to the photograph on the left, which is also a side angle. If you look at the nose for each player, photograph on the left, photograph on the right, you see a lot of similarities. Look at the chins on the two guys. Some similarities there, although we do have to account for age. If this is Bobby Jones on the left, we've got to keep in mind, now he's 8 years older for the 1985 Topps card. Obviously, the hair is completely different. because he's got what appears to be straight brown hair on the right, the permed curly look on the left. Both players, though, do have glasses. So the glasses are in common, very similar in terms of the noses, similarity in the chins for the two players. So maybe a little more of an indication that this could be Bobby Jones on the card. Then I get a phone call from Mike O'Very. And actually, let me tell you, before I get this phone call from Mike O'Very, one of the Angels players on that 1976 Angels team, I actually got a response on the article that I wrote for the Hardball Times. People can post comments on the article. And this comment came in, and it's from Stacy Collins Campbell. She writes, "Thank you for the article, but that is definitely not my Uncle Dave. I got a good chuckle at the thought of him perming and or lightening his dark hair. Thanks again for the article. He was so dang fast and a blast to watch on the field." So I got a confirmation that without question, this is not Dave Collins. We kind of knew that already, but now we have the niece of the player. She confirms that. And then after this development, Mike O'Very, who must have seen this article, calls my house. I don't know how he got my number, but he found my number in Cooperstown, called me up. Now, I wasn't home at the time, so he only left a message. And I'm going to have to paraphrase what he said because I wasn't able to save the message. But basically, he said, "Hey, Bruce, this is Mike O'Very. I played for the Angels back in the 70s. I want to tell you about that baseball card you wrote about, the Dave Collins card. And I can tell you who it is. I know with 100% certainty, it is Bobby Jones." Mike O'Very, without question, knew that it was Bobby Jones just by looking at the picture. So what we had initially suspected, but we weren't 100% sure. I was maybe 60% convinced that it was Bobby Jones on the card. But when I got the call from Mike O'Very, left the message, sounded very sure, 100% no doubt, and he was able to reveal to us that yes, Bobby Jones, the player on the card. Now, I don't want to just leave the story there because Bobby Jones is really a fascinating guy. Bobby Jones was a veteran of the Vietnam War, and he served in Vietnam. He didn't just go to training. He was in Vietnam. He saw battle. And he was at one point stationed at a military base that got shelled for something like 40 days in a row. I mean, it was just awful. And because of this constant shelling, now he survived that, but because of the constant shelling, he suffered permanent hearing loss in both of his ears. He didn't go completely deaf, but he lost significant hearing both of his ears. Now, Jones had been a minor league player prior to that. He had actually come up with the Washington Senators. Then they moved to Texas, became the Rangers. From there, he got traded to the Angels. While he was still in the Washington organization, that's when he got drafted into the Army during Vietnam. And by Bobby Jones' own admission, Vietnam, it changed him in many ways. And one of the actual positive effects, believe it or not, was that it made him more dedicated about baseball. He became more serious. He kind of admitted that in his earlier days, before he entered the Vietnam War, he kind of took a lackadaisical approach to baseball. He took it as a game, as something to be fun, but he didn't work at it. He wasn't serious about it. And then after what he saw in Vietnam, he became a lot more serious. So he comes back, starts putting up better minor league numbers, eventually makes the major leagues with the Rangers, then spends some time with the California Angels. And he kind of played off and on throughout the rest of the 70s and into the mid-1980s. Spent still a lot of time in the minor leagues. He was kind of a backup outfielder, a fourth or fifth outfielder, but still managed to have a pretty decent, fairly lengthy career. And if not for what Vietnam did to him in terms of making him more serious, I mean, who knows whether he would have made the major leagues. Now, Vietnam changed him in other ways too. It gave him nightmares. In fact, he almost had a nervous breakdown in the early 1980s. I believe he was a coach at the time. And he just literally started shaking one day in the clubhouse, and one of the other coaches noticed him, and he actually had to undergo counseling because of some of these flashbacks he was having to his experiences in wartime. But the really good part of the story is that Bobby Jones would find tremendous success as a minor league manager. He would become a manager in the Rangers farm system for, I believe, more than 20 years. He managed at Oklahoma City for much of that time, became a legendary figure there. And he is really now considered one of the great long-term minor league managers in recent history. I mean, he's absolute legend in Oklahoma City in terms of what he did as a minor league manager. So he overcame an awful lot, and he found a way to have a decent career in the major leagues before really becoming a standout, finding his true calling as a minor league manager. So that's the story of Bobby Jones. Dave Collins had a nice career as well, became a coach for a while, I believe now retired from baseball, as is Bobby Jones as well. All right, so that's the first of our 3 mystery cards. We're going to do 2 more cards. I'm not going to spend as much time on either of them, but I still want to get into what I think are a couple of very interesting error cards, where once again we see that the wrong player is shown in the photograph. It does not match the name on the card. So now that we know that Dave Collins is really Bobby Jones, let's move on to the Joe Rudi mystery. Here we have a 1973 Topps card, and we ask the question, where is Joe Rudi? Now, Joe Rudi, at the time, was an all-star Gold Glove left fielder for the world champion Oakland A's. Here he is. This is his 1973 Topps card. He is supposed to be the guy in the middle. And that player in the middle has just hit a home run, and is congratulated by 2 of his Oakland A's teammates. So in a way, Topps had 3 chances to get Joe Rudi in this card. But Joe Rudi is not the player on the left, he's not the player on the right, and he's not the player in the middle, even though that's supposed to be Joe Rudi. That player is actually Gene Tenace. And if you go back to the 1972 World Series, just a few months before this card came out, Gene Tenace had that phenomenal World Series where he hit, 4 home runs against the Cincinnati Reds. He was a big factor as the A's defeated the Reds in 7 games. So without question, that is Gene Tenace. Now you might wonder, why did they make this mistake? Joe Rudi is a prominent player, well known. Why did they get another player, one of his teammates, Gene Tenace? Well, it's somewhat understandable, because if you go back to when this photograph was taken during the 1972 season, all of the A's players, you might remember, they all grew mustaches during the season. Charlie Finley, who loved these kinds of promotions, promised a $300 bonus to every player that grew a mustache by Father's Day. Well, back then, $300, that was pretty meaningful money for major league players. This is before free agency. This is before arbitration. Players were not making big bucks. Charlie Finley is willing to give each player $300. So every player on that A's team grew a mustache. So if you consider all of the white or the Caucasian players on the A's, they all have mustaches. Put a helmet on them or a cap on them. They all kind of start to blend in together. They've all got mustaches. It starts to become a little more difficult to maybe tell one of these players apart from another. So a little bit understandable why they confused Gene Tenace for Joe Rudi. So we definitely know it's Gene Tenace, just by sight. I think anybody that followed baseball back then knows that's Gene Tenace in the middle of the photograph. It's supposed to be Joe Rudi, but without question, it is Gene Tenace. Now, the other 2 players, that's a little more problematic, in part because neither of those 2 players on either side of Tenace were very well known. Certainly not as well known as Tenace. By 1973, Tenace is a household name. He'd had that great World Series, and he was appearing on talk shows, subject of many feature articles. By 1973, Tennis is a very well-known name in baseball. There's also another problem trying to identify these other two players who are not as well-known as Tennis. The A's used 47 players in 1972, which for the time period was a lot of players. You know, you have a 40-man roster. Back then, to use 47 players in one season, that was a lot. It was a real revolving door all summer long. Well, I had written an article about this card, and I think I'd written it for the Hardball Times again. After I wrote it, I got a note from a faithful internet reader, and he told me that not only was it Gene Tennis in the middle, but he was able to identify who the other two players were, and he was able to specifically pinpoint the game in which this photograph was taken. One of the clues that he determined, and very sharp, noted that the A's are wearing their all-white uniforms, white tops, white pants. Well, back in the early 70s, the A's only wore their all-white uniforms for Sunday home games, Sunday afternoon games at the Oakland Coliseum. So right away, we eliminate any other day of the week. Only Sunday home games would qualify. And then this guy, this faithful internet reader, started doing research, started looking through box scores. And he was able to determine that the photograph was taken June 25th of 1972. The A's were hosting the California Angels in a doubleheader at the Oakland Coliseum. So this photograph is actually from the second game, game 2 of the doubleheader. Gene Tennis has just ripped a 3-run home run against the Angels pitcher. It was a left-hander named Ricky Clark. And the two players who scored ahead of him were Bill Voss, who had singled, and the third baseman, the captain, Sal Bando, who had drawn a walk. Well, Bando, I can tell you, is not in this picture. It's not Bando on the left, it's not Bando on the right. Certainly not Bando in the middle. That's Gene Tennis. So the internet reader was able to figure that Bill Voss, backup outfielder, is the player pictured on the left of the card. So he's one of the two guys congratulating Tennis for the home run. Bill Voss was a journeyman outfielder. He had been acquired only 5 days earlier from the Milwaukee Brewers. He was in the midst of a stretch of games where Dick Williams, the manager, was using him as Oakland's starting right fielder. Voss would not last long in Oakland. He would only play with the team through late August, when he was traded to the St. Louis Cardinals for Matty Alou. So here we have a guy who didn't start the season in Oakland, didn't finish the season in Oakland, but just happened to be on the team when Gene Tennis hit the home run and got his photograph taken at the Oakland Coliseum. What about the other player, the player on the right of your screen? Initially, I thought this was starting pitcher Blue Moon Odom. Blue Moon Odom pitched for the A's in the second game of that doubleheader. He pitched 8 shutout innings in earning a 6-0 victory. And of course, you have to remember, this is 1972. This is one season before the DH. So pitchers would have still been batting. So I guessed Odom. But again, my faithful internet reader told me, no, it is not Blue Moon Odom. Checking the box score, he was able to figure out it is utility infielder Marty Martinez. He was the on-deck hitter, and he happened to be Oakland's starting second baseman that day. Like Voss, Martinez did not last the entire season in Oakland. He'd be traded to the Texas Rangers less than a month later as part of a deal that brought slugging first baseman Don Mincher to the Bay Area. So 2 not so well-known players, Bill Voss, mostly a backup outfielder in his career, and Marty Martinez, a Latino infielder, usually a backup on the teams he played, although he did start this day, as did Voss for the A's. They're the 2 players, Voss on the left, Martinez on the right, and Gene Tennis is in the middle. So Mystery is solved thanks to our faithful internet reader. I wish I had his name. I lost his name. That's why I have to keep referring to him as the faithful internet reader. Perhaps one day he will re-identify himself to me, but I do appreciate his help responding to an article that I had written years ago when I did not know who these other two guys were with Gene Tennis. All right, we have one more baseball card that we're going to take a look at. We're going to jump ahead in time now, 1989 Topps. And this is actually a 1989 Topps traded card or update card. So this is a card that came out in the middle of the season, reflecting some changes to the rosters of teams. Now, this Topps traded card is supposed to show a rookie catcher for the New York Yankees named Bob Garin. We can see him in a full crouch, ready to receive a warm-up pitch. Well, once again, we do not see a photograph of the player listed. This is not Bob Garin. It turns out that it is a guy named Mike Fennell, F-E-N-N-E-L-L, Mike Fennell. At the time, he was not a player in the Yankee organization. He was actually their bullpen catcher. And we're going to tell you how he ended up on this card in a moment. Now, Fennell, who sadly has since passed away, he died rather young. We're going to talk about that. But he played professional baseball. He was drafted by the Yankees out of Lemoyne in the 10th round of the 1982 draft. They assigned him to Oneonta, which is 22 miles down the road that way. Not far. Was part of the New York Penn League at the time. By the way, Fennell became a teammate of John Elway. That was the same year Elway played in Oneonta. Fennell, left-handed hitting catcher, first baseman with a good batting eye. He showed promise as a rookie in the New York Penn League, compiled a .401 on-base percentage. He would continue to show promise in his second season, playing for Greensboro of the South Atlantic League. And, you know, here you have a young guy, left-hand hitter, disciplined hitter who can catch. Looks like he's got a pretty decent future. But unfortunately, luck did not follow Fennell. In his third season, he had injuries. He was limited to 54 games in the Florida State League. He was bothered by a shoulder problem, which really affected his play. After the season, he undergoes surgery on his his throwing shoulder. This is prior to the 1985 season. He does eventually return in 1985. He's assigned to Double-A Eastern League. So they actually bumped him up from single-A ball to Double-A. But he wasn't the same after the surgery. He continued to struggle. He batted only .175 and ended up getting released. And unfortunately, his professional career ended rather suddenly. But he was a guy with a lot of smarts, and he had a great attitude, and the Yankees were impressed with him. So they hired him as a minor league coach at a very young age. And then eventually they promoted him to the major league staff as their bullpen catcher. And he was holding that position in 1989 as the Yankees bullpen catcher when Topps released this card of Bob Garin. Now, how did Fennell end up on the Garin card? It was not Fennell's idea. This was a practical joke that was all Bob Garin. It was his idea. It happened during spring training. Garin wanted to play a practical joke on the photographer, whom he apparently knew. So he asked Fennell to substitute and pinch pose for Garin, for himself. So Fennell stepped in as the Topps photographer, never realized the difference, never confirmed that it was Garin. Of course, Garin was a rookie, not well known at the time, so it's understandable. Now, I'm not sure exactly why Garin wanted to play this practical joke so badly, because he actually denied himself a chance to be on his rookie card. But apparently playing the joke was more important to him than actually appearing on his first Topps card in 1989. Now, after he leaves the Yankees, Mike Fennell finds tremendous success as a high school baseball coach. 1992, he was named the head coach at McQuaid Jesuit High School in Rochester, New York. Over his first 6 seasons there, he did phenomenally. The team won 75% of its games. He eventually led McQuaid to its first sectional title in 20 years. Not only was he successful as a coach, but he was very popular in the Rochester area where McQuaid is located, became a father figure to his players. And Fennell, in turn, he loved his players. Generally, they played hard and they played well for him. The relationship seemed like it was going to last for a long time, but then some very difficult circumstances intervened. 2000, late 2000, winter of 2000, after the season, Fennell was diagnosed with lung cancer, even though he had never smoked in his life. Just one of those things. He does return to manage McQuaid in 2001, even though he's got this diagnosis. And then just days before McQuaid is set to play in the championship game, Fennell had to be hospitalized. He was not feeling particularly well. Now, he did eventually get out of the hospital, but over time, his lung cancer worsened. The following year, May 15, 2002, Mike Fennell succumbed to lung cancer. He's only 42 years old. Here was a guy so successful as a high school coach, so successful in the Rochester community, and he was taken away at such a young age. And even though he was very young, he was a guy that had really wisdom of somebody that was much older, a smart guy, knew the game, understood the fundamentals, knew how to relate to players, really knew how to work with players, and really a heroic figure to this day, to the folks at McQuaid and to the folks in the greater Rochester area. So not Bob Garin, but the late Mike Fennell making an appearance, his only appearance on a Topps baseball card, part of that Topps traded set in 1989. So that's our baseball card mysteries program, our first one, maybe the first of many. We'll see what the ratings are when we take a look at those. In the meantime, though, we'd like to take your questions in our Zoom group chat. Question from Rob Lanterman. Rob wants to know any comment on the 1969 Topps Aurelio Rodriguez card. I actually thought about doing a baseball card mystery on that. That's a fairly well-known story, maybe more well-known than these three. But for those not aware, Aurelio Rodriguez's 1969 Topps card does not show him. He was a third baseman with the Angels at the time, but it actually shows Angels bat boy Leonard Garcia, who would later play minor league baseball. Unlike the Fennell Garin card that we just talked about, this was not a prank. Apparently, the photographer for Topps had taken a bunch of photographs at Angels training camp, and I'm guessing he did this in 1968, because it was for the 1969 Topps set. And among the photos were some photos of the bat boy, Leonard Garcia, who normally would not be on a card. Well, all these photographs made their way back to Topps. Somehow the Garcia card got slipped into the Rodriguez file. And because the two guys had similar facial features, even though the bat boy was much younger, the mistake was not caught. Nobody realized that Leonard Garcia, the bat boy, had made it onto the Aurelio Rodriguez card. So not a prank, not a joke, just an innocent case of mistaken identity involving the bat boy. And also, you have to remember, Rodriguez was still pretty early in his career, not as well known as he would become in his later years with the Detroit Tigers. Stephen Sankner wants to know, how about the 1989 Al Leiter card? That's a great one. And I thought about that one as well. Al Leiter, New York Yankees, is not on his 1989 Topps card. It actually is a young left-hander, a minor leaguer named Steve George. I don't think Steve George ever made it to the major leagues. I think he made it as far as AA or AAA. And as far as I know, that was just another innocent mistake. Young player coming up. Leiter was a top prospect, but the Topps photographer or whoever was involved in identifying the photos, labeling the photos, apparently got mixed up. Leiter with George. They had in common, they were both young left-handers who had pitched in the minors in 1988. But Leiter was the top prospect. He was the guy who would go on to a long career in the big leagues with several teams. So Al Leiter's rookie card, 1989 Topps, does not show him. It is a minor leaguer named Steve George. Let's see if you have any other questions in our chat room. Daniel Cummings wants to know, who is your favorite out of all three of these cards? Well, I guess I'm a bit biased because I really am a Joe Rudi fan. I like the A's teams of the early 70s. I've written a lot about them. I used to follow those teams with their green and gold uniforms. And then also many years later, back when I started here at the Hall of Fame, it must have been in the late 90s, Joe Rudi came here one day. And I'd always heard he's, this nice guy, nicknamed Gentleman Joe. And he wasn't disappointing. He was the nicest guy in the world. I could see why they called him Gentleman Joe. He was so friendly. We talked for quite a bit. I think we took him on a bit of a mini tour of the library, as I recall. He gave me one of his wife's business cards. His wife at the time, a real estate agent out in the West somewhere. And I think Joe worked a little bit in real estate at the time. But he was great. He was terrific, and actually once left a message on my phone at home, just like Mike O'Very had done. I can't remember why Joe called. Maybe he was telling us he was coming to the Hall of Fame to visit, but had a great time, met him. So he was one of my favorite players from that A's team, from that era. And I think it's just kind of cool that you have three players on the team and none of them happen to be Joe Rudi. It's just one of those freak things. That happened. Gene Tennis, good player as well. Joe Rudi, very good player, all-star, gold glover, but you cannot find him on any Topps cards in that 1973 set. Let's see. Who is the catcher on the Joe Rudi card behind the A's players? That question comes in from Max Thompson. That is a great question, Max. I'm trying to remember the name of the catcher who played for that team. It was not Jeff Torborg. It's another guy, right-hand hitting catcher, good defensive catcher like Torborg, and I just cannot remember. Let me consult my notes here. I have part of that article. Trying to see if I wrote down anywhere where that Angels catcher was, and apparently I did not. Of course, I don't have the complete article here, so I'm going to have to refer to it. So, Max, tell you what I'm going to have to do is I'm going to have to go back to my files and take a look at the complete article, because I think at some point I do write who that catcher was, and I'll post it on the Facebook page later this afternoon. If you go to our Hall of Fame education page on Facebook, and I'll put the answer. I just can't remember that catcher. It was not Jeff Torborg, but it was another right-hand hitting catcher, and he was in that photograph. You can see just his cap, his Angels cap, just to the right of Marty Martinez. Steven Sankner is saying Ellie Rodriguez. It's possible that it was Rodriguez, but I'm thinking it was another guy. I'm thinking of another guy, and his name's on the tip of my tongue, and I just cannot remember it. So, somebody just put in who I think it's Art Kushner. I believe it is Art Kushner, spelled Kusnyer, Art Kushner. I'm almost 100% sure that it's Art Kushner, but just to make sure, I'm going to check the article, and I'll post on Facebook on our education page a little bit later on. So that's our first edition of Baseball Card Mysteries. We hope you've enjoyed it. If you enjoy programs like this, we do encourage you to be a supporter of the Baseball Hall of Fame. And you can become a member pretty simply. All you do is go to our website, and there is a membership tab that you can go to. First, you want to go to baseballhall.org. That's our website, baseballhall.org. Click onto Join and Donate, then click on to become a member. So baseballhall.org, click on to Join and Donate, then click on to become a member. If you want to be an individual member, which is one of just several different categories, it's $50 for a full year membership. You get a personalized membership card, subscription to our 6 Memories and Dreams magazines, which come out each year, Hall of Fame yearbook, complimentary admission to the Hall of Fame for 1 full year. You also get discounts and free shipping on purchases from our museum store and also from our website store. And you get a member lapel pin as well. So all of that comes with being an individual member, only $50 a year. We also have junior memberships. We have family, sustaining, all the way up to President's Circle, lots of different levels. Whatever you can afford, whatever you're comfortable with, we would certainly appreciate your support. Think about becoming a member of the Friends of the Baseball Hall of Fame. We do appreciate you joining us today for our baseball card mystery. Hope that you had a good time with it. I certainly did. Have a great day, everybody. Take care.